Thank you for joining us for another episode of Baker Hosts Ad Nauseam, a podcast series focusing on new and trending advertising issues with an emphasis on the FTC and the NAD. I'm Randall Rubenking, and you're listening to Baker Hosts. We are once again joined by Amy Mudge and Daniel Kaufman, two partners from Baker Hostetler's advertising, marketing, and digital media team. Together, they have decades of advertising experience and approach advertising issues from multiple perspectives. On today's episode of Ad Nauseam, Amy and Daniel talk about the FTC's case against MoviePass and a recent HBO documentary called MoviePass Movie Crash. With that, welcome to Ad Nauseam, and let's turn it over to Amy and Daniel.
Welcome back to Ad Nauseam. And we have used this phrase before, a very special ad nauseam before, but I'm going to reserve that for when it really, truly applies. And today is that day. It is a very special ad nauseam episode. And, it may have happened later in life than he had hoped, but my delightful, personable, charming co-host has finally made his cinematic debut in a recent HBO documentary called MoviePass Movie Crash. The documentary explores the rise and the demise of MoviePass, that highly memorable service that promised consumers one movie a day at any theater for a low price of $10 per month.
So, Amy, I have to say thank you first. And close-ups on the movie screen, very scary after a certain age, but not going to oversell it, but I am in the documentary.
You were gorgeous. You were the star. You carried the whole thing, Daniel. It was mesmerizing.
I could see every year of my age on that screen for about the 25 seconds that I'm on it. So let's not overstate it. And the most disappointing thing, though, apparently that was not enough to get me an IMDb credit. So without an IMDb credit, does it really count, I ask you?
I am going to find out who we apply, who we protest to. I'm going to work on that, Daniel. That is on my to-do list. You absolutely deserve all of your glory. I mean, the documentary wouldn't have been what it was without reference to the FTC investigation of these
Which
folks.
is more of a footnote in the documentary, but an interesting footnote. Very interesting footnote that has all sorts of implications for the work that we do.
And, of course, it relates to Rosca and subscriptions and stuff we do talk about a lot. So before we really get into the substance, I just got to know, how did this come to be? How did you end up, I'm going to call it starring. It's just, who's to say, How did you end up starring in this documentary? Set aside your, I hate my pores. What was it like seeing yourself on the big screen?
It's hard to talk about that without talking about my pores, but let's start from the beginning. One of the interesting things about working for the FTC is the breadth of work that they do, covering all sorts of different subject areas. So really interesting cases in all sorts of areas. And every once in a while, documentary filmmakers do get interested in some cases that the FTC has worked on, whether directly or more indirectly. So a couple of years ago, I got a call from these documentary producers that were looking into MoviePass. They reached out to me because my name is on the press release at the FTC announcing it. I was the acting director.
You were acting director at the time when that,
Yeah. So, I talked to them, talked to the firm. I was like, this sounds like a lot of fun. Love to do it. They seemed legit, quite legit, actually. And I headed down to New York for a couple hours of interviewing. It was kind of in the middle of COVID. So there were COVID precautions, all that. Sat in a conference room. It was lovely. They were very nice, good to get along with. But it was just me and the film crew sort of talking about asking a lot of questions and having me give answers. And then I remember this very well afterwards. I was downtown. I went to a lovely outdoor cafe in Soho, and I got a really delicious and beautiful French omelet. I remember it very well. I don't think I've eaten French omelets very often in my life, and they're just delightful and lovely. I guess that's not really the important focus. And then fast forward, I hadn't heard anything about the documentary for almost 2 years. I finally heard from them, and then I found out that they were airing it at a theater at Lincoln Center a few weeks ago. So went there with my sister-in-law, and it was really cool. The stars of the documentary were there. They talked on the stage about sort of the history of MoviePass, what happened, and then it started airing on HBO just recently. So from beginning to end, it was an interesting experience, lots of fun, and it is very odd to see yourself on the screen.
Okay, so and now it's pretty much all downhill from here for
It is
you.
all down. My
I
15
know.
seconds are over. Thank you, Andy Warhol.
I mean, I've been in firm life my entire career, and I will tell you, nobody's ever called me and invited me to be on a big screen documentary. I actually can't quite believe you were invited to a premiere at Lincoln Center and somehow chose a relative over me as your fabulous red carpet date, but we will move on. And the importance of keeping the podcast civil.
I had a lovely time with Carrie, but I do want to flag something interesting. When they interviewed me, being the FTC nerd that I am, I didn't just talk about the case, but I also did explain to the filmmakers why the MoviePass case is actually a really important case for us ad law folks. It, of course, stayed on the cutting room floor. They could care less about that. But Movie Case is a really significant case for FTC practitioners, and it's become even shorthand that we now use MoviePass to describe a certain type of Rosca case.
Yeah, I mean, the case was certainly significant. Above and beyond anything related to subscriptions, it was a very expansive and novel interpretation of what ROSCA, or the Restore Online Shoppers Confidence Act, was supposed to cover, which was, really focused on subscriptions. And I know the case was basically called Fat ROSCA. And why was that the case? No, Daniel, it was not a reference to your to your appearance in the movie. I digress. You looked amazing. You looked very upstanding in your suit in the conference room. But as far as the disclosures, the subscription disclosures, the signing up for the program, did you know you were going to get charged every month? The disclosures were fine. In fact, they were beautiful. They were delightful. The issue that the FTC looked at and used ROSCA to look at were the underlying representations about the product itself that were challenged. Ergo, Fat ROSCA.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When you look at Rosca and the cases the FTC brought for years, they were just focused on were the disclosures good? Did you disclose adequately the monthly information and all that? And then all of a sudden, at the FTC, after AMG, there was a real big focus on we must closely look at every single statute we've been using and figure out are there more clever, broad interpretations we can take of those existing statutes. The AMG case had an enormous impact on the agency. You've got, for decades, you're using 13B to get money. The court says, yep, can't use 13B for that anymore. So ROSCA, of course, was one of the statutes that was looked at closely to see is there another way we can sort of expand the scope of ROSCA and not just use skinny ROSCA, but expand it to go after not just the negative option feature aspects, but what they're saying about the product. And there is ambiguity. There is sufficient ambiguity, according to the FTC and according to me at the time, about the language in ROSCA and the ability to go after not just those disclosures about how often you pay and how much, but to sort of the underlying representations about the product.
Well, and why that's so important is because ROSCA has built-in penalties. You violate the statute, you can get money under ROSCA, as opposed to the cutoff, essentially, that AMG did to really focus on consumer redress. And they're big penalties, right? They're like in the $50,000 per violation.
Well, penalties and/or redress also. So redress can be on the table as well for ROSCA cases, and very often the FTC is seeking to get redress instead of penalties in ROSCA.
Or you could theoretically get both, right? Depending on how fat you wanted to go in a day.
Exactly.
Now, we've seen this, and I don't know, it seems like ROSCA shaming to call it Fat ROSCA, but I'm going to continue there. So we've seen this.
We're going to get in trouble for this somehow, I can tell.
We got to get right here, Daniel. But we've seen this, let's call it expansive ROSCA.
Okay.
We've seen this expansive view of ROSCA pop up in a few other cases. I think the FTC case against cash advance provider FloatMe had a fat ROSCA count that focused on material terms about the merits, that disclosures about what was happening when they advanced you the cash were not adequately disclosed. And, we got to be clear here. This is a huge strategic tool for the commission. If you're focusing ROSCA not just about the requirement to disclose key information about the negative option feature, and of course allow an easy means of cancellation. But if you take it out of the disclosures about negative options and focus it on disclosures generally about a product that you're selling on an ongoing basis, I mean, that's using a general civil penalty statute to challenge almost any claims that are made by a product company using a subscription. So, that's a big deal.
Well, and it's certainly meaningful that the FTC's new proposed negative option rule doubles down and basically would require and allow this broad interpretation for all negative options and expressly puts language in that proposed rule on that. More to be seen on where that rule goes and what happens. But of course, to be clear, no court has yet evaluated whether this expansive view of ROSCA is a valid reading of the statute. So there's still that, I guess.
Well, and this was one, certainly when now we have a full commission again. Although I do miss the earlier two Republican commissioners that would publish very colorful dissents in many of these cases. And in the MoviePass case, former Commissioner Noah Phillips really had issues with this. And, I think he was on the Hill when ROSCA was passed. And so he was kind of there when they made this and in his mind really understood what was intended by ROSCA. And it was intended to be a focus on cabining abuses in the subscription sign-up model. It was not meant to be used to go after subscription companies for anything and everything. And I think his dissent was very clear in that. Although the other Republican commissioner at the time, Christine Wilson, she did not dissent. And she, like you said, she said, I think there's enough in ROSCA that talks about making sure there's disclosure of material information, period, that she thought gave some more leeway to read it more expansively.
I mean, it's interesting, Amy, this question of statutory interpretation. And the general philosophy is that if the language of the statute is clear, that's what you look at. What does the language say? And if it's ambiguous, then you can look at sort of the intent and purpose and goal of the legislation. But according to Christine Wilson's statement, the language, when you look at the language in isolation, allowed the FTC to bring this kind of case. So very interesting to see how courts may interpret that going forward. But Amy, I know you, as I, have been following the FTC for quite a long period of time. Is there anything you ever come across during your time that you think would make actually an interesting documentary?
Well, that is an easy one, Daniel. That's any case in which I was involved. So perhaps somebody might call me and put me on an HBO Max documentary. Although, since typically my role is, as your role is now, is defending folks in these things, query whether we'd actually be allowed to say anything without blowing up the attorney-client privilege. But no, I think there's a lot of good. I mean, there are cases that involve celebrities, that are semi-celebrities. I think any of those would be fodder. Maybe some of the, the old kids advertising cases. I mean, frankly, I think a documentary about the FTC itself would be interesting. And, dating back to the days when there was very aggressive attempts to regulate kids advertisers, and the FTC was called, the national nanny, and really kind of put back in its place to do what it was supposed to do. And I think we see some of that much more aggressive posture, not just in the MoviePass case, but more generally. So I think kind of looking at the history of that and seeing if maybe the FTC is repeating some of that now would be really interesting.
Interesting. So from my perspective, one of the other fun cases, or interesting cases, I should say, I got to work on, one of many people that got to work on this at the FTC, Kevin Trudeau, the former sort of, I think, self-proclaimed king of the infomercials. The FTC's brought a number of cases against him over the years, lots of colorful history and an interesting story there to be told as well.
And you would get invited to come back again. So,
I would
all right.
hope so. But again, there are many FTC people that have worked on that case over the decades.
You might be insufferable if you were in a second documentary. I don't know if we can live with you then. But ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Kaufman will be signing autographs at the ANA Law Conference and the NAD Law Conference.
And I do want to say, look, it is a really interesting story. I think the documentary folks put together a really interesting story about the company, its origins, what happens, how the changes happens. I thought it was a really compelling 90 minutes, I thought.
I did too, Daniel. I saw it this weekend. I'm giving you a lot of grief about this. It was an absolutely fantastic watch. It's a crisp hour and a half. Did not suffer from a lack of editing. So, look, we encourage everyone to take a look at MoviePass Movie Crash. It is now streaming on HBO Max. In uncharacteristic form, we will not end with to-dos.
Except to watch the movie. Gosh.
Watch the movie. It's a one and done to do. But Daniel is happy to talk about his experiences. And we, of course, are always happy to talk about Rosca. You can catch our prior Ad Nauseam episode that focuses on subscriptions. And certainly we'll be back talking to you about that more when that FTC negative option rule gets finalized, because that'll be a good time to take a look at this again. But thank you so much for joining us for another edition of Ad Nauseam, and we will see you soon.
Thank you, Amy and Daniel. If you have any questions for Amy or Daniel, their contact information is in the show notes. For more information on the latest developments in ad law, visit our Adventures in Law blog at www.adventures-in-law.com and check out all Ad Nauseam episodes by subscribing to Baker Hosts wherever you get your podcasts. As always, thanks for listening to Baker Hosts. Comments heard on Baker Hosts are for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. Listeners should not act upon the information provided on Baker Hosts without first consulting with a lawyer directly. The opinions expressed on Baker Hosts are those of participants appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information about our practices and experience, please visit bakerlaw.com.